Chapter 1. The Old Code. A Sword Shown in the Sun. "Not bad," shouted Sir Bowen. Then he pulled out his sword and started to fight Prince Einan. The prince fell to the ground. "But you'll have to fight harder than that or you'll die," laughed Sir Bowen. Sir Bowen was one of King Freyne's knights. Prince Einan was the king's son. He was 14 years old and a strong young man. He liked fighting, but he didn't like losing. He got up quickly and took up his sword again. "That's better," laughed Bowen. The young prince smiled. Then suddenly he felt Bowen's sword hard on his arm. "Dead again," laughed Sir Bowen. Einan started to fight again. His face was angry now. "Careful, careful, fight with your head, don't fight with your heart, boy," shouted Bowen. The knight wanted to make Einan a good fighter, but he also wanted to teach him the old code. Sir Bowen and all the kings, princes, and knights before him were knights of the old code. For thousands of years, kings were kind to peasants, and knights helped kings. This was the old code. Life was good, and everybody in the country was happy. Then everything started to change, and the peasants were angry. Bowen didn't like this. He loved Einan, and he wanted the boy to remember the old code all his life. After the sword fighting lesson, Bowen and Einan sat down. "Never turn your back to somebody when you fight, Einan. Why can't you remember that?" Suddenly they heard the sound of a horse. They looked up and saw Brock, one of the king's knights, on his horse in front of them. Bowen didn't like Brock and looked at him angrily. Brock didn't live by the old code. "We're fighting the peasants," Brock told them. "We're winning, of course. King Freyne wants his son to come and watch." "It's not good or clever to fight the peasants," answered Bowen. He really hated Brock. "They're stupid. The king says they have to die. He wants Einan to come now, and you too, Bowen," Brock shouted. Then he turned his horse and rode away fast. "Why did he shout at you?" asked Einan. "You're a knight of the old code. You're not afraid of him." "No, of course I'm not afraid of him. I hate him. He doesn't live by the old code. He enjoys killing the peasants. He's the king's man." Einan understood. Bowen hated his father, the king, too. He smiled at Bowen. "When my father dies, I'll be king, and you'll be my man, Sir Bowen." Bowen looked at Einan with love in his eyes. "I'm your man now, my prince," he answered warmly. Chapter 2. The Battle. Brock rode quickly back to the battle. When he got near the fighting, he heard the sound of swords. He laughed loudly when he saw hundreds of peasants dead on the ground. In the middle of a field, Brock could see King Freyne on his horse. The crown on the king's head shone in the sun. On his coat was a picture of a dragon's head on a sword. The king looked down at the dead men below him with hard eyes. With a cruel smile on his face, he pulled out his sword. The peasants on his right and left were afraid. They ran away fast, but the king followed them. He loved fighting and killing. Nothing could stop him now. High above the battle, Sir Bowen and Prince Einan sat and watched. Bowen hated the fighting, but Einan was excited. "I want to fight down there with my father," he said. "No, you don't, boy," Bowen answered sadly. I do, Einan shouted. "And I want to see you fight too, Sir Bowen. You're the best fighter in the world." "Yes, I am a good fighter. Better than your cruel father," Bowen said angrily. Einan felt unhappy when he heard this. "Don't be angry with him, Bowen. He is my father, and he is the king." Bowen smiled kindly at the prince. He didn't want to make Einan unhappy, but it was difficult for him to watch the battle. He was a knight of the old code, and it was wrong to kill the peasants. "Yes, Einan, your father's king now," he said to the boy. "But one day you'll be king and you'll wear the crown on your head. When you're king, remember today, and remember the old code. Never, never fight the peasants. Then the crown will shine wonderfully on your head, and you'll be a better king than your father." Bowen turned to watch the battle with a heavy heart. He didn't see the prince's eyes when Einan spoke. They were as hard as the king's. "Yes, I'm going to be a better king than my father, Bowen," answered Einan. Then he suddenly shouted, "Oh, look, my father's killing more stupid peasants." Down below them, the king and his knights rode through the peasants' village. They cut down men with their swords and burnt their homes. One of the peasants stood near his house and watched the king carefully. This man's name was Redbeard. He had red hair and a red beard. He suddenly shouted loudly, "Now!" When the other men heard Redbeard, they quickly came out of their houses. They looked angry and dangerous. They ran after Redbeard to the king on his horse and tried to kill him. The king rode out of the village fast, but the peasants followed him. They pulled him from his horse and began to hit him. Then they all jumped on him hard. From above, Einan watched the fighting and cried, "No, no, they're killing my father." He quickly jumped on his horse and rode down to the battle. "Stop, Einan, stop!" shouted Bowen, but Einan didn't listen. Bowen climbed onto his horse and followed fast behind the boy. But when he got to the battle, he couldn't find the prince anywhere. "Einan, Einan," he called, but there was no answer. Einan found his father on the ground and sat down near him. He looked at the king's gray face and cried, "Father, father." Then he looked at the beautiful crown on the king's head. "My father's going to die," he thought. "I'm going to be king, and I want that crown now." Einan started to take the crown from his father's head, but the king suddenly opened his eyes. He looked at the boy and tried to stop him. For a minute, father and son pulled at the crown, but Einan was stronger, and he won. Old King Frayne looked at his son angrily. Then he closed his eyes and died. When Einan stood up with the crown in his hands, he saw a young peasant opposite him. The man stood on a bridge with a large bucket on his head. He suddenly jumped off the bridge and fell onto Einan. They fought for a long time. Then the peasant, Buckethead, pushed his sword into Einan's heart. The prince fell to the ground with his hands round the crown. When the peasant looked down at the prince at his feet, the bucket fell from his head. Einan could see a lot of lovely long red hair. Buckethead was a woman, not a man. Her name was Kara, and she was Redbeard's daughter. She wore dirty old clothes, but she was very beautiful. Suddenly somebody shouted, "Einan! Einan, where are you?" When Kara heard this, she quickly ran away. Sir Bowen ran to Einan and cried, "It's me, Einan. I'm here, my king." Einan looked up at Bowen and then closed his eyes. Bowen took the prince in his arms and tried to help him. But the boy didn't move. The knight could do nothing. Chapter 3. The Great Dragon. In the king's castle, Queen Aisling sat in her room. She looked out of the window with sad eyes. She couldn't see the battle, but she could hear the sound of fighting. "The old code says it's wrong to kill the peasants," she thought. "My husband's a bad, cruel king." Suddenly Brock, the king's knight, ran into the room. "Queen Aisling, your husband's dead," he said. "The peasants killed him. King Frayne is dead." The queen listened to Brock quietly. Behind him, she could see Sir Bowen. His face was tired and sad, and he stood with her son, Prince Einan, in his arms. "I'm sorry, Queen Aislinn," said Bowen with his head down. The prince fell too. "Don't be sorry, Sir Bowen," answered the queen. "They killed Einan because of his cruel father, the king. Now put him on my bed." But Einan wasn't dead. The crown," he said weakly. Bowen put the crown into Einan's hands. But the queen didn't listen to him. She stood next to Bowen and looked down at her son. Then she slowly took off his shirt. "We can't help him now," Bowen said sadly. The queen said nothing. She walked to the window and looked at a beautiful picture of a dragon on the wall. "Perhaps we can, Bowen," she answered. "Perhaps we can." Queen Aislinn rode quickly. She turned her horse and started to climb the mountain behind the castle. Brock rode in front of her and Sir Bowen followed. Behind them, 2 men carried Einan carefully up the mountain. After a long time, Bowen heard the sound of music, a strange, sad song. It came from somewhere inside the mountain. Then Einan made a sound and his eyes closed. Bowen got off his horse fast and ran to the young boy. Wake up," he shouted. "Don't go to sleep, my king. You can't die now. Listen to me and remember the old code." Bowen then spoke quietly into Einan's ear. He talked to him about the old code. Einan moved his mouth and tried to repeat Bowen's words. He didn't want to die on the cold mountain. They climbed slowly up the mountain, then stopped. The queen got off her horse and turned to the men behind her. "This is the end of our journey. We're going into the mountain now." It was a cold, dark place, and it looked dangerous. "Follow me. Don't be afraid," said the queen. She walked in and the men followed her. They couldn't see much. There was a lot of smoke and there were dead animals on the ground near their feet. Then Bowen heard the strange song again. Suddenly the music stopped. From out of the dark, somebody asked sadly, "Are the stars shining tonight?" "No, there aren't any stars in the sky tonight," answered the queen. "Is that Queen Aislinn, wife of King Freyne?" said the dragon. "Yes, great dragon. The people in my country love you and the other dragons. We're your friends." "No, madam," answered the dragon. "Men and dragons were friends for thousands of years, but things are different now." The dragon came slowly out of the dark and sat on the ground near the queen. "Bring Einan here, Bowen," said the queen. The knight carried Einan in his arms and put him down on the ground. The dragon's face was high above him. It was very ugly, brown and black with a large mouth, big teeth, and sad eyes. Bowen felt very afraid. He never took his eyes away from that face. The dragon looked down at Einan. "It's King Freyne's son," he said. "I hated the king. He loved killing dragons and peasants. What do you want from me, Queen Aislinn?" "I want your help," answered the queen. "A peasant hurt my child in the battle. Einan's not the same as his father, Great Dragon. This knight, Sir Bowen, is teaching him the old code, and I'm going to teach him about dragons in the future. Please help him." "You're asking a lot, madam. Your son's very ill," said the dragon. "I know," cried the queen. "But he's king now. He'll be a good king. Sir Bowen and I will help him. He won't be cruel, Great Dragon." "He has to say that, not you," answered the dragon. Then he looked at Bowen. "Give me your sword, knight." Bowen pulled out his sword and gave it to the dragon. The dragon stood over Einan with the sword in his hands. The boy opened his eyes. He saw the dragon and tried to move away. "Don't be afraid, son," said the queen quietly. "The great dragon's going to help you. I will help you, boy. But first you have to say these words. I won't be a cruel king. I won't kill dragons and peasants. I'll love my people and be kind to them. I'll always live by the old code. Now, are you ready? Repeat them after me. Enon was very tired, but he repeated the dragon's words. Then he fell back into Bowen's arms. Einon, Einon, shouted Bowen. No, no, he's dead. Bowen was very angry and tried to pull his sword away from the dragon. But the dragon shouted, Knight of the old code, stop! Watch me, now! Then he pushed Bowen's sword into his heart. A red light came out of the dragon. He caught the light in his hands and turned to Einon. This light's half my heart, boy. I'm giving it to you. It'll make you strong. Enjoy a long life and always remember the words of the old code. Einon's eyes slowly opened. He felt weak, but he wasn't dead. Bowen looked at the boy. Then he looked up at the dragon. I'm sorry, great dragon. I was angry and afraid. Thank you. You can help Einon now, Sir Bowen. Teach him the old code well. Never forget my words. Before Bowen could answer, the dragon went back into the mountain. Everything was dark and cold again. Nobody spoke. They listened to the sound of the strange, sad music. Chapter 4. Cruel King Einon. Einon sat on his horse, high above the peasants. He looked strong and happy with his father's crown on his head and his sword in his hand. I'm king now, he thought. I love watching my peasants. They're building me a wonderful new castle. It's going to be bigger and better than my father's old castle. It's going to be the greatest castle in the world. King Einon was as hard and cruel as his father now. He never remembered the words of the old code or the great dragon in the mountain. He hated the peasants, and they had to work harder and harder every day. Brock, old King Freyne's knight, rode past Einon on his horse. Behind Brock, some peasants walked slowly up to the castle. They looked weak and ill. They didn't look up at the king when they walked past. But Einon looked down at them and suddenly shouted loudly, Stop! Brock, stop! Brock quickly jumped down from his horse. Look, Brock! There! That peasant there! That's Redbeard! He killed my father! Einon and Brock looked at the tall, strong peasant with the red hair and red beard. Redbeard looked back at them with hate in his eyes. Yes, I killed your father, boy, he shouted at Einon. You can thank me now. Now you're king and the crown's on your head. Brock ran to Redbeard and put his sword up near his face. No, Einon shouted. Don't kill him, that's too kind. He smiled cruelly at Redbeard. Look at me, dog, look carefully. You can see me now, but you'll never see me or anything again. Get some wood from the fire, Brock. Burn out his eyes. Brock got some wood from a hot fire. Redbeard watched him angrily, but he wasn't afraid. Brock put the burning wood near Redbeard's eyes. Then he suddenly stopped. He felt a sword on his arm, and the wood fell from his hands to the ground. He looked up quickly and saw Sir Bowen. Bowen called to the peasants, Run away! Quickly, run! The peasants understood. They ran away from King Einon and his castle as fast as they could. Kara, Redbeard's beautiful daughter, ran to her father. Father, father, are you all right? She cried. Kara, quickly! Shouted Redbeard. Let's go, run! And Redbeard and Kara followed the other peasants. King Einon was very angry with Bowen. He jumped down from his horse and pulled out his sword. What are you doing, Bowen? He shouted angrily. Those are my peasants, not yours. Who's king in this country? Me, not you. Bowen got off his horse and pulled out his sword too. They started to fight, but after a few minutes Einon fell to the ground. Bowen stood over the boy and looked down at him. "Einan," he said, "don't do this. What's wrong with you? Are you ill? Remember the old code, Einan. Remember my words and the words of the great dragon." "I'm king now," Einan shouted back. "Kings don't have to live by the old code." Bowen couldn't understand Einan. He took him by the arm and cried, "I taught you the old code, boy. I taught you everything. Never forget that. What's wrong with you?" But Einan didn't listen. He pulled his arm away and started to fight Bowen again. Again he fell to the ground. Bowen looked down at him sadly. "Fight with your head, boy," he said. "Don't fight with your heart. His heart. His heart." Bowen thought about the dragon's words in the mountain. "This light's half my heart, boy. I'm giving it to you." Why was Einan as cruel as his father now? Was it because he had a dragon's heart, not a man's heart? Bowen threw his sword down on the ground next to Einan. He sat down near him on the ground and looked into his eyes. "Everybody has to live by the old code, Einan. Kings, knights, and peasants. Everybody in the country. Why can't you understand that?" Then he slowly stood up. He got on his horse and rode away. Brock wanted to ride after Bowen, but King Einan said, "Let him go, Brock. He's an old man. He doesn't understand. I don't want him to help me now. I'm a king, not a child. Go and find Redbeard, and when you find him, burn out the stupid peasant's eyes." Brock rode away fast and looked for Redbeard. When he found him, he burnt out his eyes, slowly and cruelly. The peasant could never see Kara, his beautiful daughter, again. Bowen slowly rode away from Einan with a heavy heart. He thought hard about the boy and the dragon. Einan isn't a cruel boy, but he's got half the dragon's heart. That's the problem. It's the dragon's heart. So now he's as bad as his father. I'm going to find that dragon and kill him. The knight rode quickly back to Queen Aislin's castle. Then he started on his long journey to find the dragon. After many days, he arrived at the dragon's cold, dark home in the mountain. But this time the dragon wasn't there. Bowen shouted loudly, "Dragon, can you hear me? Where are you, dragon? Why did you do it? Why did you give my king half your cruel heart? I'll never stop looking for you, dragon. And when I find you—" Bowen stopped shouting. He stood in the dark and listened. Outside, from somewhere above him, he could hear the dragon's strange song. He quickly jumped on his horse and rode away. He wanted to find the music. And the dragon. Chapter 5. Sir Bowen and the Dragon. Sir Bowen rode up the mountain all day and all night. Early the next morning he saw an old man on the road in front of him. "Who's this?" he thought. "Who's he talking to? And why is B0H he riding a horse and riding at the same time?" "Old man!" he shouted. "Be careful! Look at the road, not at your books. Now please move out of my way." The old man turned round and saw Bowen. Then suddenly his face went white. He looked very afraid. "No! Help! There's a drag." "What is it?" asked Bowen. "What's wrong?" Behind you," answered the old man. "Look behind you." Bowen turned round quickly. Behind hither was a big, ugly dragon in the sky. The knight pulled out his sword and they began to fight. This dragon wasn't as big or strong as the great dragon in the mountain. In minutes it fell to the ground with Bowen's sword in its heart. Then everything went very quiet. The old man spoke first. "Oh, thank you, knight. That dragon looked very dangerous. We nearly died. I'd like to thank you 1,000 times." All right, it's dead now," answered Bowen. "Old man, what's your name? And what are you doing here?" My name's Brother Gilbert, and I'm a monk. I ride on my horse round the country and try to help people. And I write stories about my journeys. I write about kings and knights, about dragons and the old code. Well, I'm on a long journey too, brother. So I'll say goodbye now, answered Bowen. Will you ride with me, knight? Asked Brother Gilbert. Yes, I'd like to ride with you, brother. We can talk. Let's go. And the two men went slowly up the mountain. When it was dark, they stopped for the night. They were hungry and thirsty, and they cooked some meat on a hot fire. Then the monk read one of his stories to Bowen. It was a story about the old code. What do you think, Sir Bowen? Did you like it? Asked Brother Gilbert at the end. I liked the meat, brother, but not your story. The old code's dead, said Bowen sadly. Nobody lives by the old code now. Ride with me, good knight, and find the old code again, answered Brother Gilbert. I'll ride with you, brother, but I'm not going to look for the old code. I'm looking for a dragon, and when I find it, I'm going to kill it. The next morning, Bowen and Brother Gilbert climbed on their horses again. They talked and laughed. The monk told Bowen more stories. After some time, Gilbert got off his horse and sat down on the ground. He started to write a story about Bowen and the dragon. Suddenly, the ground round the monk began to move, and his pen fell out of his fingers. Then his papers flew everywhere. Help! Help! What's happening? He shouted. Bowen turned round on his horse and saw the monk with his papers on the ground. Then, in the river behind him, he saw a dragon. He rode quickly down to the river. When he got there, he heard the dragon's strange song again. Don't come into this river, knight, or you'll die, the dragon said. I'm not afraid of you, shouted Bowen. Aren't you? Shouted the dragon. Then look at this. Out of the river, the dragon threw a dead man and his horse. That man tried to follow me into the river. Look at him now, and there are more down here. Brother Gilbert stood behind Bowen. He was very afraid, but the knight got off his horse and pulled out his sword. Come and fight me, dragon, he shouted. You can't hurt me. The dragon carned slowly out of the river and went behind a tree. Bowen could feel the hot fire from the dragon's nose, but he couldn't see him very well. On the ground, round the tree, were dead men and horses. Bowen moved nearer the tree. He felt afraid, but he didn't want the dragon to know. Why is all that fire coming out of your nose, dragon? It's too wet in the river to start a fire, you know. He laughed. Why do you knights always want to fight and kill us? Do you think it'll make you famous? The dragon asked. I don't want to be famous, answered Bowen with his sword in his hand. But I want to be rich. These days people pay me for dead dragons, and I'm going to kill you. Oh, you kill dragons for money. You're that knight, said the dragon. Well, I have to live, answered Bowen. Yes, everybody has to live, laughed the dragon. Let's start the battle then. Yes, let's, shouted Bowen. I'll enjoy killing you. Bowen moved nearer. The dragon watched him, and then he saw the knight's sword. I know that sword, he thought. I used it in the mountain to cut out half my heart for King Einan. He suddenly left the ground and flew up into the sky. He flew higher and higher above Sir Bowen and Brother Gilbert. The knight quickly climbed onto his horse and rode after the dragon. Bowen followed him for a long time, but in the end he got down from his horse, tired and angry. Then the dragon flew down from the sky. You're clever, shouted Bowen. Cleverer than the other dragons. Come here, I want a good fight. Well, it'll be your last, said the dragon. They started to fight. The dragon hit Bowen hard and he fell back into a tree. He got up quickly and shouted, You won't win, you know. I'm going to kill all dragons. There's only me, Knight. I'm the last dragon. Bowen didn't know that this was the last dragon in the country. When he heard this, he stopped fighting for a minute. The dragon watched him and came nearer. He pushed Bowen hard and the knight fell over. Bowen could feel the fire from the dragon's nose. It burnt his face. He heard Brother Gilbert shout. Then everything went black. When Bowen woke up, he was inside the dragon's mouth. He pulled out his sword and shouted, "Don't bring your teeth down, dragon, or my sword will go up." Nothing happened. Bowen sat in the dragon's mouth all day. Outside, Brother Gilbert watched and waited. In the evening, the dragon tried to speak, but it was difficult with Bowen in his mouth. "Don't put your sword, UFP, or my teeth come down," he said. Bowen looked round the dragon's mouth. He saw an old shirt between two of the dragon's teeth. He pulled it out, and a man's hand came out with it. "Oh, that's Sir Eglamour's shirt," he cried and threw it away. "Thanuffs," said the dragon. "That's been UFP der effa months. Now get your sword off my teeth." "Oh, be quiet. It's hard for me too, you know," answered Bowen. The conversation was very boring and difficult for the dragon. "Oh, ma moofif dry," said the dragon after a short time. "Listen, get out af ma moof and let's talk face to face." Bowen got up slowly and the dragon opened his mouth. The knight stood between his big, dirty teeth. With his sword in his hands, he looked up at the dragon. He felt very afraid. Then he suddenly fell onto the ground outside with his sword next to him. "Kill me, then," he shouted up to the dragon. "I don't want to kill you," said the dragon quietly. "And I don't want you to kill me. I'm old and tired and I don't want to fight. I've got an idea. Listen." Bowen was tired and hungry. He wanted to eat and sleep. He looked up at the dragon and said weakly, "So tell me, what's your idea?" Chapter 6. The Dragon's Idea. The dragon began to tell Bowen his clever idea. At the same time, down below them, the peasants worked hard in Sir Felton's fields. Sir Felton was one of King Einan's rich knights. One of the boys suddenly stopped his work and looked up at the sky. "Father, father," he cried. "Look, up there." The peasants looked at the boy. Then they looked up at the sky. There, above them, was the dragon. "Help! He's coming down," they shouted. "Look at that fire coming out of his nose. It's going to burn us. Run, fast!" The dragon flew down to the ground. He started to burn down Sir Felton's fields and buildings. There was fire and smoke everywhere. Sir Felton heard the peasants and quickly ran out of his house. But before he could say a word, somebody behind him said, "Look at that! Those dragons, can I help?" Sir Felton was very, very angry. He looked round and saw Sir Bowen with a smile on his face. "Stupid dragon!" he shouted. "Look, my fields and my buildings, they're burning." "Well, I can help you," answered Bowen. "But you'll have to pay me. It'll cost a lot of money." "I won't pay you anything," shouted back Sir Felton. "Do you hear me?